Shogun episode 2 came out the same day as episode 1, which I think was a smart move. This episode ends on a cliffhanger and definitely in a spot where the action is ramping up and it has one of those endings where you're like, damn it, now I have to wait a week. And we found out that the director is at least claiming that it's only going to be one season. So he's going to cover the book, story's going to wrap up, and that's going to be it. Which after a couple episodes, I think this show definitely has potential to have one really good season and just be one good series overall. And not get dragged out until the quality drops off and all that kind of stuff happens. So to start off episode 2, this episode has quite a bit that happens story-wise and action-wise. And I think this one is the one that really should get you hooked in if you weren't after episode 1. And if you're not hooked in after this one, I'm not sure if episode 3 would do it. Because here we get to see a lot of the characters' relationships start to grow and develop. You can really tell where the story is headed. And after one episode of kind of getting introduced to them, now you really feel like you know them and know what they want and where they're going. And this is another pretty dense episode. So let's get into it. To start off, we have Toranaga talking to the dying Taiko. And the Taiko was talking to his kid, and he asked everyone to leave the room so he could talk to Toranaga. And he asked Toranaga if he would like for him to grant him the power and title of sole regent until his son becomes of the appropriate age, which they said was 16. Toranaga says no, all my enemies would turn against me, and we would all end up dying. And the dying Taiko calls him wise. So this is where the idea comes in to have 5 regents kind of in a power stalemate until the kid is old enough. It's just a nice short scene of the two old friends talking, but you really get to see who Toranaga is at this point. And that he's clearly a long-term thinker, he sees the big picture, he doesn't seem super power hungry or ambitious. I think all this stuff just makes him a really easy character to root for. Just generally speaking, I think people who are thrust into power when they don't want it are much more likable than their super ambitious, power hungry types that we see in the real world. So this one is called Chapter 2, Servants of Two Masters. And this is a pretty good title for the episode because of the stuff that happens. These are spoilers, obviously. Obviously, you have John, who is going to end up serving Toranaga and his own country. You have Moriko, who's serving God or the Catholic Church and Toranaga. And you have someone else who commits a betrayal later who is serving Toranaga and then their own actual leader. You also have Yubashige, who's serving Toranaga and Ashido. So he has 2 masters. So normally you don't get very much out of a title, but I wanted to mention that because I thought it was appropriate. The Portuguese pilot is talking to one of the fathers, the higher-ups of the Portuguese Catholic people, and he gave them the journals that they found on the ship that John was on. And the father's like, good, these incriminate them, give the journals to Toranaga, they'll be hanged for piracy. Done. And the other characters explain to him that Toranaga is very thorough and that this also incriminates them. So they can't just hand the books over and have John hanged and be done with the Protestant problem they have. And looking back, the Portuguese pilot also understood this, so it was a bluff that he made to John. As the Portuguese pilot is leaving the other 2 religious guys, he says, just so you know, he calls him the pilot, he's referring to John, is not a man to leave his fate to God. You shouldn't either. As kind of a way of saying, like, look, he's obviously clever. He's navigating his way in this hostile world where he doesn't even speak the language. He's still alive. Don't just assume it's going to work itself out unless you do something about it yourself, which is a pretty important line for later in this episode. The Portuguese monk is going to translate for Toranaga. He runs into Yaichiro, the heir to the throne, and the kid is asking if the barbarian is a cannibal because he's heard some of them eat humans. And the guy says, I don't know, but I'll keep my distance, which is obviously him leaning into the fact that everyone thinks they're barbarians because the Portuguese are at war with the British. So obviously he knows he's not a cannibal. But it's just like all these little details are nice that they just keep consistent with demonizing the other side. So the kid called him Suji, which means translator, and he explains to John that Anjin means pilot, or Anjin. And there's something interesting here that I can't quite make out which way to interpret it. Maybe it's more clear in the book. When the Portuguese monk comes in, he's a little bit confused by Moriko being there. And Toranaga says, I hope you don't mind. I asked her to sit in here to practice her Portuguese. He looks a little bit caught off guard, but he doesn't lie about the translation at any point. It's interesting because I can't tell if he was going to tell the truth anyway because he's religious, or if he was going to screw John over, but now that Mariko's there, throw a wrench in their plans. It's an interesting dynamic because I still don't know and I've watched it twice. Either way, I like this move from Toranaga because it's clearly a calculated move where he had Moriko come talk to him in his room and ask her to come do this and then sent for her. And everyone was like outraged that she was a woman being called upon by a regent, but he did it anyway. And it's another good mark on his character that he'll use anyone around him regardless of stereotypes or traditions or culture in order to do what he can to the best of his abilities. So John explains that these two are enemies and that's why he doesn't trust him. And John claims that his queen would like to be an ally with the Japanese and not go to war with them. Toranaga asks, well, what would you do if we did go to war? And John says, I guess I would die, because he can't imagine beating him. So he's being super humble because he understands their whole honor and respect culture, at least enough to navigate that far, which again is just reflective of his quick thinking and his ability to adapt to a pretty crazy situation in another country where he's treated hostilely and he can't even speak the language. There is an interesting bit in here where Toranaga's like, but don't you guys both believe in Jesus and God? And he has to explain that they're like slightly different still, even though they're both Christians. And there's a good little dry humor in here where John's like, our gods are a little bit different, but I won't know for sure until I'm dead. And Toranaga's interrogating him and he's like, so you came halfway around the world and became a pirate for this god that you almost believe in. And John's explaining that he's not a pirate, and Toranaga's like, you guys have all these weapons. And John explains that they have approval to defend themselves against the Portuguese and anybody else. Ishido shows up and he's like, you brought a barbarian into my home, blah, blah, blah. And again, a little bit more dry humor. He calls him ugly with a dog's face. And essentially he says that he wants him thrown in jail and that because they're in his territory, it's his decision. So he goes to jail. We see Mariko at her house at night talking to her kid over dinner. And the kid's asking what he looked like, if he actually had blue eyes and yellow hair and that sort of thing. And her husband comes in. He's really abrupt and saying that he's gossiping with their son like a little girl. And you can see that their relationship was purely political, just to have an heir. And that's kind of it. And to me, my first thought with this was, okay, like they have her being the translator. They're getting along. Her husband's being shown to be kind of rude here, or at least detached. This is probably the beginning of a romance arc between John and Mariko. At least that's how it seems to me like it's setting up at this point. And this is where you see how big of a deal it is that Toranaga called on Mariko, because Toranaga's right-hand guy comes over and he's like, hey, Lord Toranaga's calling another meeting. And the general automatically assumes him. And he says, no, not you. He wants Mariko. And everybody's a little bit confused and surprised. Like, it's obviously a very big deal to let a woman that close to power in this culture. But we go and see Kiri talking to Mariko, and they're kind of reminiscing. Toranaga comes in and says, leave his interpreter alone. And she's talking about how she's an old lady now and needs respect. And they make a couple little banter jokes where she talks about something growing unobtainably, and he says, just like your ass. Or growing out of control, something along those lines. It's an amusing scene just to see, that they have a seemingly happy marriage, regardless if it was political or whatever. And Mariko explains that she's skeptical of John, but she trusts the priest. But as the audience, we can see that the priest is starting to be a little bit shifty. Obviously, we know about the Portuguese motives, and all that's going to come to light later in the episode. But this is kind of laying the groundwork for that. So they're talking. His people around him are getting frustrated that he's worried about this barbarian instead of worried about his impeachment, because they're all going to die if he gets sentenced to death. And he talks about his spies, and he explains that the two Christian regions, Kiyama and Ono, one of them is the leper, are going to ask for the execution of the barbarian, but the barbarian, John, troubles the Portuguese. So obviously he wants to keep John alive and use him and create a divide between the two Christian regions and the two non-Christian regions. John's in jail. He's talking to this old guy, and this old guy is kind of giving the background of each region. He explains that this is Tsukiyama, comes from a long family of samurai. He explains that Toranaga is a prisoner here in Osaka, and that John's in trouble because this is Ishido's territory. This region is Ono, who was a warrior who came down with leprosy, and the Christians healed him, so he's very religious. And this is Kiyama, the other Christian region. And he explains that Kiyama is essentially using Christianity to fuel his own ambition. He kind of explains what's going on to John and gives us a brief summary as the audience. Even though you've probably already gathered what's going on, this is kind of a bullet point summary of who each person is. And now John realizes, like, oh shit, I got caught in these political games. The guy who took me in and was protecting me as a prisoner here, and he's going to be executed. And this guy explains to him that he's never going to leave Japan alive. And obviously John repeatedly has been saying, I can't die in this place, just over and over. And they have their little sit down. They're talking about what they're going to do with their votes. And the two Christians say, we can't vote to execute Toranaga while that barbarian's alive. So you need to execute him first, and then you can have our votes. So obviously you can see here, everybody's making their little plays for what they want. The Christian regents want him executed before they get through with the vote, presumably to keep pushing their ideology and whatever it's bringing them power-wise. And Ishido is irritated now because he has to acquiesce to these requests before he can get the execution of Toranaga, which is his ultimate goal so that he can take over entirely. John's talking to this guy in his cell, And the guy explains essentially that they're using Christianity in exchange for silk, gold, guns, and trade with the Portuguese. And he explains that they have a base set up in Macau, which is a little peninsula on the coast of China. The Portuguese are running trade through there with like Japanese mercenaries essentially. And the Chinese hate the Japanese. So John realizes that this is like the leverage that he needs to become useful to Toranaga and help him incentivize him to keep him alive. Because he understands now that the Portuguese have been lying to Japan about what they're actually doing, which he's going to explain in a few minutes here. Essentially, Spain and Portugal had decided to divide the world in half, and they can conquer anything they want, spread Christianity as they see fit, that sort of deal. This guy is the captain of the black ship, and he's frustrated because they haven't gotten approval from Toranaga to leave the port, and obviously he needs to leave the port in order to do trade and make his money on behalf of the Portuguese church. The father here refers to the black ship as his ship and his operation, and the captain says, "You mean our operation?" And he's getting frustrated with him. Mariko and the father are talking. He's asking how her Latin's coming along. She says her Portuguese is better. And mainly she's like, "I don't want to translate anymore because I don't like the way that he talks to you." So obviously at this point, she's still on the father's side. And as the audience, we know that the father is a shyster and that Portugal is trying to spread Christianity and sort of slowly take over culturally everywhere in the eastern half of the world. And it kind of seems like Mariko is picking up that something's off here, because even though she says she doesn't like the guy, John, the father says you've always had good instincts about people that you shouldn't trust. And she doesn't say anything, and she's facing away from him, but she does have a look on her face kind of like maybe she's starting a little bit leery also. That's kind of open to interpretation, though. You could take it either way, I think. We see Ishido and Yubishige meeting, so if somehow it wasn't apparent to you before that he was a traitor, this is as direct as you're going to get. But Ishido says, "Oh, it's the samurai that I once pulled out from under a mountain of corpses," and Yubishige says, "Oh, it's the guy who won't stop reminding me." I think it's an interesting way of saying, like, don't forget your place and remember our deal, and that sort of implication here. While also establishing that they have a history, they fought together, they've known each other for a long time. And we get a little bit of bitching here. He's kind of shitting on Toranaga being an ingrate. And he explains that the walls of this castle were built by the finest stone that all the lords could send, and that the Taiko chose his as the corner piece. Which is obviously a big deal. Corner pieces are the keystone and all that. Yubishige does something interesting here that I think is kind of subtle. Ishido is asking him what he thinks of the barbarian and what Toranaga sees in him. And Yubishige says he's a pirate, he's a man of no character, he's simple and brash. Pretty much describes him as the opposite of what we've seen, but he knows that Ishido will believe it. But then he tells the truth, that Toranaga sees him as someone who hates the Portuguese and the Portuguese hate, and that he could be a wedge between Ishido and the Christian regions. And it's a really subtle and good way to tell a lie, because he kind of plays into what Ishido already believes, along with telling him the truth. And he also mentions the cannons and guns. Obviously, 20 cannons and 500 guns is a big deal in this setting. And I think it's at this point that we can see, okay, Yubishige was going to betray Toranaga, but he's slipping back to him. If you catch it. This is probably something that you wouldn't catch the first time. I definitely didn't, but maybe you're more observant than I am. And Ishido denies it, that there's any divide between the regents. But Yubishige says he's thinking of the future, and that afterward, with the Christian help, that the two Christian regents would beat him in a war. And the implication is that he wants to ally with Ishido and take the barbarian and his guns under control for their side. Ishido says, unfortunately, I had to order the barbarian to be executed. And then Yubishige says, maybe I can do something about it. John is getting taken to his execution, and obviously you can see he's blindfolded and tied up, and they get attacked by bandits. And of course, the bandits are actually working for Yubishige, who comes in with his men and then kills all the bandits once Ishido's men and the bandits are dead that he paid, so that they have John, and now he has control of him. And this is a pretty cool scene because John just freezes, because obviously he's blindfolded and tied up. He doesn't even try to run, he just stands there. You can hear the arrows flying and people screaming and fighting all around him. It'd be scary as shit from his perspective. John thanks him in Japanese, and Yubishige is laughing, and he's like, oh, look, he's speaking civilized tongue. And he's like, let me teach you this. And he teaches him how to say, I'm a dog. And obviously John has no idea what he's saying. It's a little bit more dry, kind of dark humor there with all the dead bodies around. So we go back. John's in front of Toranaga again. Yubishige says, I just happened to be on a walk and saw him being taken for his execution, and they were under attack by bandits. And Toranaga says, you do have a way of being in the right place at the right time. Pretty clearly saying, like, I know what the fuck's going on. Mariko shows up to translate. John and her introduce themselves, And now he's going to talk to Toranaga, pretty much try to make himself useful. And Toranaga apologizes that he had to go to prison, but it seems like he kind of expected it. John makes the claim here that his queen would want to be allies with Japan, not enemies. And this is all his way of trying to get backing to help Toranaga in his own war. Toranaga asks John to draw a map of the world as he knows it. He points out Japan and England, and this is where he explains that Spain and Portugal have agreed to divide the world in half as they see fit to spread their Christianity. And that their ultimate goal is to run everything with Catholicism under the Portuguese flag, or the Catholic Church, whichever you prefer. And this is a huge revelation. They actually don't believe him. And Mariko's like kind of not translating at first because she's so upset about this. Yeah, so she's upset and calls him a liar and asks him to swear by his God, and he does. So she eventually translates for him. And Toranaga kind of can't believe it because he's like, did he actually use the word belongs? And John explains what he wants is to team up with Toranaga in Japan to get rid of the Portuguese. Because obviously the Portuguese are benefiting economically and through trade from Japan, these other countries that England doesn't have access to. Toranaga tells him to give up, he's outnumbered and it's hopeless. And John says, unless I win. Which is kind of funny, but also I think kind of a dumb line. Like, it's hopeless unless you win. I guess it's technically true. It's a line that I was just kind of like, huh, when I saw it. That felt out of place. It felt like it was supposed to be part of a trailer or something. They just included it. He's a guest in Toranaga's house now because they're going to team up. Mariko explains to him it's Mariko-sama because she wants essentially respect and she's married. And that's more formal when he addresses her. And they also ask John if he wants a bath and he says, no, I just bathed in the village. And they all think he's really weird for not wanting to bathe. Which is a nice little detail to kind of, again, touch on the cultural differences that we see throughout the show and obviously history. The father comes and asks Toranaga to release the black ship and let it do trade before the seas get dangerous because of the seasons. And Toranaga's like, no, I don't think so yet. And why don't you explain to me why you guys are building secret bases all around our region? And obviously the father is super uncomfortable because now they've been called out for what they were trying to hide. And Toranaga has confirmed, based on his reaction, that this was the truth. One of the maids that night goes around and starts assassinating people in Toranaga's house. And she ends up coming to try to assassinate what she thinks is John. But Toranaga, because he knew this was going to happen, had actually switched their rooms. So he was waiting there awake with his sword ready. And he slit her throat. And John actually got hurt in the process trying to protect him. So obviously he's earning points for bravery and taking their side. And Toranaga, again, shows how clever he is and how much he understands his enemies. And Toranaga realizes that this wasn't Ishido. It was one of the two Christian leaders. Or possibly the Portuguese themselves, trying to get rid of John because he's causing them problems. It's not quite clear to me which of the three it is. But yeah, that's the end of the episode. So if you watch these back to back, this is a really tough spot to end in because now you're like, oh, the action's starting and shit's getting intense. And then you have to wait a week. But yeah, I really enjoyed this episode. I love how subtle the characters are. They all do smart things. The decisions they make with the information they have makes sense. A really basic thing to say, but it's just so nice to see after watching a fucking show like Halo, which is an absolute pile of dog shit, and everyone has to be an idiot for the plot to function. It's nice to see smart, thinking characters who all have their own personalities and cultures, goals. It's just a really well fleshed out show. So yeah, episode 2 was a good one, and on a tough cliffhanger for a week before episode 3. If you've watched it, let me know what you think. If you haven't, well, I just spoiled quite a bit for you, but go check it out anyway. It's obviously better than I'm going to describe in a 20-ish minute video. And if you comment, I'll try to respond, as long as you're not just calling me an asshole or an idiot or any other clever thing the internet comes up with. Like and subscribe and all that shit. See ya. Thanks.